The rain was relentless, pounding the cracked pavement of Mill Street as Ethan Cole sprinted through the night, his heart hammering louder than the storm. At 18, he'd never felt so alive or so terrified as he clutched the crumpled note from Lucas, the boy who'd turned his world upside down. "Meet me at the old mill. Midnight. We need to talk." Ethan's sneakers slapped against the wet ground, his breath fogging in the cold Virginia air. The small town of Havenwood slept soundly, oblivious to the secret that had been burning in his chest for months. He'd always been the good kid straight-A student, varsity soccer player, the son his parents bragged about at church. But loving Lucas Kane wasn't something he could confess over Sunday dinner. Not in Havenwood, where whispers about those kinds of people carried like poison on the wind. The mill loomed ahead, its rusted roof barely visible through the downpour. Ethan slowed, his eyes scanning the shadows until he saw him Lucas, leaning against the wall, his black hair plastered to his forehead, his green eyes catching the faint glow of a street lamp. At 18, Lucas was everything Ethan wasn't: bold, unapologetic, the kid who'd rather sketch in a notebook than play by Havenwood's rules. "You came," Lucas said, his voice low but steady, cutting through the rain. "I had to," Ethan replied, his throat tight. "What's wrong?" "Your note sounded urgent." Lucas stepped closer, his expression a mix of fear and resolve. "My dad found out. About us." The words hit Ethan like a punch, stealing his breath. Lucas's father, Pastor John Kane, was Havenwood's moral compass, a man whose sermons could silence a room. "He saw my sketchbook drawings of you. He's furious, Ethan. He's talking about sending me away." Ethan's world tilted. He'd always known their stolen moments late night talks by the river. Hands brushing in the school library came with a cost. But this? "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Lucas reached out, his fingers grazing Ethan's cheek. "We fight for this. For us. Or we run." The weight of that choice pressed down on Ethan, heavier than the rain soaking his clothes. Running meant leaving everything: his family, his future, the life he'd been groomed for. But staying meant hiding, lying, pretending Lucas was just a friend. He looked into Lucas's eyes, searching for an answer, and found only the same desperate hope mirrored back. "I can't lose you," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "But my parents, they'll never understand." Lucas's hand tightened around his. "Then we make them. Or we leave them behind." The mill's creaking walls seemed to close in, amplifying the roar of the storm and the pounding of Ethan's heart. He thought of his mother's proud smile, his father's firm handshake, the college acceptance letter on his desk. Could he throw it all away for love? For Lucas? Before he could answer, headlights sliced through the rain, pinning them in a harsh white glare. A car door slammed, and Pastor Kane's voice boomed. "Lucas, get away from him." Ethan froze, his hand still in Lucas's, as the pastor stormed toward them, his face a mask of rage. Behind him, Ethan's father, Richard Cole, stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable but cold. The world Ethan had fought to keep intact was unraveling, and there was no going back. The next morning, Ethan sat in his bedroom, staring at the suitcase his mother had left on the floor. "You've got 1 hour," she'd said, her voice trembling with a mix of grief and disgust. "We can't have this in our house." His father hadn't spoken at all, just turned away when Ethan tried to explain. The word abomination lingered in the air, unspoken but deafening. Lucas was gone by dawn. Pastor Kane had dragged him home, promising to fix him. Ethan had no idea where conversion camp, a relative's house, or somewhere worse? His text to Lucas went unanswered, and the silence was a knife in his chest. He packed slowly, each item a reminder of the life he was losing: his soccer jersey, a photo of his family at Christmas, the notebook where he'd written poems for Lucas. At 18, he was being erased from his own story, all because he loved another boy. The bus station was a gray blur of faces and diesel fumes. Ethan clutched his ticket to Richmond, the only place he could afford to go. He'd heard about shelters there, places where kids like him could start over. But as the bus pulled away from Havenwood, he felt the weight of every mile stretching between him and Lucas. In Richmond, Ethan found a shelter run by a kind woman named Maria, who didn't flinch when he mumbled the truth about why he'd been kicked out. "You're not alone," she said, handing him a cup of coffee and a list of job openings. "You'll find your way." Days turned into weeks, each one a struggle to survive. Ethan worked odd jobs: dishwasher, delivery boy, anything to keep a roof over his head. At night, he lay awake, wondering where Lucas was, if he was safe, if he still thought of him. The pain of their separation was a constant ache, but so was the spark of hope that they'd find each other again. One evening, flipping through a local paper, Ethan saw an article about Havenwood's annual fair. A photo showed Pastor Kane, smiling broadly, his arm around a young woman. The caption mentioned his son, Lucas, away at a private program. Ethan's heart sank. A program. He knew what that meant. He tore the article out and tucked it into his wallet, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he had to fight for. Lucas was out there, somewhere, and Ethan wouldn't stop until he found him. Even if it took years. Even if it broke him. 2 years later, Ethan stood in a cramped apartment in Richmond, staring at a letter he'd written but never sent. The words blurred on the page: "Lucas, I don't know where you are, but I'm still here, waiting." At 20, he was no longer the naive boy from Havenwood. Life had hardened him: late shifts at a diner, nights spent studying for a community college degree, the constant grind to prove he was more than his parents' rejection. Richmond had become his refuge, a city big enough to hide his scars but small enough to feel familiar. He'd found a community at a local LGBTQ center, where stories like his were common, though no less painful. There, he met Sam, a trans woman who ran the center's art program. "You've got a fire in you," she told him one day, handing him a paintbrush. "Put it on canvas." Ethan wasn't an artist like Lucas, but he tried. His paintings were raw, messy explosions of color blues for the nights he'd cried himself to sleep, reds for the anger at his family, golds for the memories of Lucas's smile. Each stroke was a way to keep Lucas alive in his heart, even as the silence between them grew. One night, after a long shift, Ethan sat with Sam at the center, sipping lukewarm tea. "You ever think about going back?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "To Havenwood?" Ethan scoffed, but his chest tightened. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome." "Not for them," Sam said. "For you. To face it. To find him." Ethan's fingers traced the edge of his mug. He hadn't heard from Lucas in 2 years. No calls. No letters. Nothing. But the idea of returning to Havenwood, of confronting the past, stirred something in him, a mix of fear and defiance. "What if he's not there?" he whispered. "Then you'll know," Sam replied. "And you'll keep moving forward." The next weekend, Ethan boarded a bus to Havenwood, his heart pounding as the familiar fields and church steeples came into view. The town hadn't changed: same dusty streets, same judgmental stares. He avoided his parents' house, heading instead to the river where he and Lucas used to meet. The water was still, reflecting the late afternoon sun, and for a moment, Ethan could almost see Lucas there, sketching by the bank. He asked around, cautiously. Most people clammed up when he mentioned Lucas, their eyes darting away. But an old classmate, Jenny, now a barista at the town's only coffee shop, pulled him aside. Lucas isn't here, she whispered. His dad sent him to some camp in Georgia. I heard it was bad. Ethan. Really bad. Ethan's stomach churned. Conversion camps. He'd read about them, places that promised to cure people like him and Lucas, often through cruelty disguised as salvation. Do you know where he is now? He asked, his voice shaking. Jenny shook her head. He came back for a bit last year, but he was different. Quiet. Then he left again. No one knows where. The news hit Ethan like a wave, pulling him under. He thanked Jenny and walked back to the river, his mind racing. Lucas had been here, broken and alone, and Ethan hadn't known. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the resolve it ignited. He'd find Lucas, no matter what it took. Back in Richmond, Ethan threw himself into research. He scoured online forums, reached out to organizations that helped survivors of conversion therapy, and saved every penny for a private investigator. Months passed with no leads, but he didn't give up. He couldn't. Lucas was his heart, his reason, the one truth he'd never let go. One rainy afternoon, a call came from an unknown number. Ethan's hands trembled as he answered. Hello. Ethan Cole. The voice was unfamiliar, rough but kind. I'm a friend of Lucas Kane. He needs you. The voice on the phone belonged to Marcus, a counselor at a shelter in Atlanta. He'd met Lucas a month ago, he said, when Lucas stumbled into the shelter, malnourished and haunted. He's been through hell, Marcus told Ethan, his tone heavy. But he talks about you. Says you're the one thing that kept him going. Ethan was on a bus to Atlanta within hours, his heart a tangle of hope and dread. The shelter was a squat brick building in a rough part of the city, its walls covered in murals of outstretched hands. Marcus greeted him at the door, a tall man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He's fragile, Marcus warned. Be gentle. When Ethan saw Lucas, his breath caught. The boy he'd loved was still there, same green eyes, same sharp jaw, but he was thinner, his shoulders hunched, his gaze distant. Lucas sat in a corner of the common room, sketching in a tattered notebook, unaware of Ethan's presence. Lucas, Ethan said softly, stepping closer. Lucas's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan. His voice cracked, and in an instant, he was on his feet, crossing the room in 2 strides. They collided in a desperate embrace, Lucas's hands clutching Ethan's jacket as if he might vanish. You're here, Lucas whispered, his face buried in Ethan's shoulder. You're really here. I never stopped looking, Ethan said, his own tears falling. I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner. They sat for hours, words spilling out in a rush. Lucas told him about the conversion camp, months of isolation, shame, and therapy that felt like torture. He'd escaped a year ago, bouncing between shelters, too afraid to contact Ethan in case his father found him again. I thought you'd moved on, Lucas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought you'd forgotten me. Never, Ethan said fiercely. You're my home, Lucas. Always. They stayed in Atlanta for weeks, rebuilding what had been broken. Lucas was fragile, prone to nightmares, but Ethan was patient, holding him through the worst nights, listening when he needed to talk. They found solace in small moments, sharing coffee, sketching together, laughing over memories of their teenage rebellion. But Havenwood still loomed over them, a shadow they couldn't escape. Lucas's father was a powerful man, and Ethan's family hadn't reached out in years. Returning to Virginia felt like walking into a lion's den. But Lucas wanted closure. "I need to face him," he said one night, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I need to tell him who I am." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy but proud. "We'll do it together." The journey back to Havenwood was tense, the bus ride filled with unspoken fears. When they arrived, the town felt smaller, meaner, its streets heavy with memories. They went to Pastor Kane's church first, knowing it was the heart of his influence. The Sunday service was in full swing, the pews packed with familiar faces. Lucas took a deep breath and walked inside, Ethan at his side. The congregation turned, whispers rippling through the crowd. Pastor Kane stood at the pulpit, his face hardening as he saw his son. "Lucas," he said, his voice cold. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm here to tell the truth," Lucas said, his voice ringing out. "I'm gay. I love Ethan. And I'm not ashamed." The church fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ethan squeezed his hand, his heart swelling with pride. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The silence in the church was deafening, broken only by the creak of a pew as someone shifted uncomfortably. Pastor Kane's face was a storm cloud, his hands gripping the pulpit so tightly his knuckles whitened. Ethan felt Lucas trembling beside him, but his grip was firm, unyielding. They'd come too far to back down now. "You're confused," Pastor Kane said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "This is a sin, Lucas. You know that. Come home, and we'll help you." "Help me." Lucas's laugh was bitter, cutting through the tension. "You sent me to a place that broke me. You called it love, but it was control. I'm done hiding who I am." Murmurs rippled through the congregation, some shocked, others curious. Ethan scanned the faces of people he'd known his whole life. Neighbors who'd once praised his soccer skills. Teachers who'd written his recommendation letters. Now, they looked at him like a stranger. But one face caught his eye, his mother, sitting in the third row, her eyes wide with something that looked like regret. "Enough," Pastor Kane snapped. "This is God's house. You will not defile it with this blasphemy." "It's not blasphemy to love," Ethan said, stepping forward. His voice shook, but he pressed on. "You taught me to be honest, to be kind. But you threw me out when I was honest about who I love. How is that God's way?" The pastor's gaze turned to Ethan, cold and unyielding. "You're no son of mine," he said, echoing the words Ethan's father had spoken 2 years ago. "Then you never knew me," Ethan replied, his heart aching but resolute. Lucas's mother stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "John, stop," she said, her voice trembling. "He's our son. We can't keep doing this to him." The congregation gasped, and Pastor Kane's face flushed with anger. "Margaret, sit down." "No," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I've lost enough. I won't lose him again." The moment was electric, a crack in the foundation of Havenwood's rigid beliefs. Ethan's mother stood too, hesitating before crossing the aisle to stand beside Lucas's mother. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was wrong." Ethan's throat tightened, his vision blurring. He hadn't expected this, not forgiveness, not understanding. But before he could respond, Pastor Kane stormed out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Outside, Lucas and Ethan sat on the church steps, the weight of the moment settling over them. "What now?" Lucas asked, his voice soft. We live, Ethan said simply. We build a life. Together. They returned to Richmond, where Sam and the LGBTQ Center welcomed them back like family. Lucas started therapy, slowly healing from the trauma of the camp. Ethan took a job at a bookstore, saving for a future they could share. They rented a tiny apartment, filling it with sketches and secondhand furniture, turning it into a home. But Havenwood wasn't done with them. A letter arrived months later, from Ethan's mother. She wanted to meet, to talk. Ethan hesitated, the pain of her rejection still raw, but Lucas encouraged him. She's trying, he said. That's more than my dad ever did. The meeting was awkward, filled with long silences and tentative apologies. Ethan's mother admitted she'd been wrong, that she'd let fear and tradition blind her. I want to know you, she said, her voice small. The real you. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Ethan held on to that hope, even as Lucas struggled with his own family silence. They leaned on each other, their love a quiet strength against the world's noise. 5 years later, Ethan and Lucas had built a life in Richmond that felt like a miracle. Their apartment was small but warm, filled with Lucas's artwork and Ethan's books. They'd found jobs they loved, Ethan as a librarian, Lucas as a graphic designer for a local nonprofit. Their love had weathered storms, growing stronger with every challenge. But the past wasn't done with them. One afternoon, a knock at their door revealed a teenage boy, about 16, with Lucas's green eyes and a nervous smile. I'm Caleb, he said, shifting awkwardly. I'm your nephew, Lucas. Lucas froze, his mind racing. His sister, Emily, had left Havenwood years ago, cutting contact after a falling out with their father. Caleb explained that Emily had died in a car accident a year earlier, leaving him in foster care. He'd found Lucas through old letters Emily had kept, hidden from Pastor Kane. Your family, Lucas said, pulling Caleb into a hug. Ethan watched, his heart swelling at Lucas's openness, despite the pain of his own family's distance. Caleb stayed for dinner, sharing stories of his mother and his life in foster care. He was bright, curious, and fiercely independent, but there was a loneliness in him that Ethan recognized all too well. Over the next few months, Caleb became a regular part of their lives. He'd visit on weekends, sketching with Lucas or helping Ethan shelve books at the library. They learned he was questioning his own identity, struggling with feelings he didn't yet understand. Is it okay to be different? Caleb asked one night, his voice barely a whisper. It's more than okay, Lucas said, his eyes meeting Ethan's. It's who you are, and we'll love you no matter what. Caleb's presence brought new purpose to their lives, but it also stirred old wounds. Lucas decided to write to his father, a letter pouring out years of pain and love, hoping for some kind of understanding. The response was cold. A single line, "You are no longer my son." Lucas didn't cry, but Ethan saw the hurt in his eyes, the same hurt he'd carried since Havenwood. Ethan's mother, meanwhile, had become a quiet ally. She visited occasionally, bringing homemade cookies and stories about Havenwood's slow changes. The town was still conservative, but younger voices were starting to challenge the old ways. She even attended a pride event with Ethan, her discomfort outweighed by her determination to rebuild their bond. One evening, Caleb showed up with a sketchbook, his hands shaking. I drew this for you, he said, handing it to Lucas. The page showed two figures, Lucas and Ethan holding hands under a bright sky, with Caleb standing beside them. You're my family now, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lucas pulled him into a hug, tears streaming down his face. You're ours too, he whispered. Ethan joined them, his heart full. They were a family, not by blood but by choice, forged in love and resilience. Time moved forward, and so did Ethan and Lucas. By their late 20s, they'd saved enough to buy a small house on the outskirts of Richmond, a fixer-upper with a garden where Lucas planted wildflowers. Caleb, now 17, had moved in permanently, his foster care days behind him. The house was chaotic but joyful, filled with laughter, art, and the occasional argument over whose turn it was to do the dishes. Ethan took pride in their home, a testament to the life they'd built against all odds. He'd earned a master's degree in library science, while Lucas's designs were gaining recognition in Richmond's art scene. Caleb, meanwhile, was thriving in school, openly identifying as queer and finding support in the community Ethan and Lucas had introduced him to. But Havenwood still cast a long shadow. News reached them that Pastor Kane was retiring, his influence waning as the town's younger generation pushed for change. Ethan's mother shared that the church had a new pastor, one who spoke of love and inclusion. It felt like progress, but it didn't erase the past. One summer, Caleb convinced Ethan and Lucas to attend Havenwood's annual fair, a place filled with memories both sweet and bitter. "It's time," Caleb said, his eyes bright with determination. "Let's show them who we are." The fair was bustling, with cotton candy stands and Ferris wheel lights painting the night. Ethan felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering stolen glances with Lucas under these same lights years ago. Now, they walked hand in hand, Caleb bouncing ahead, unafraid to be himself. They ran into Jenny, the barista, who hugged them fiercely. "You're back," she said, grinning. "And you brought a kid." "He's family," Lucas said, ruffling Caleb's hair. Jenny's eyes softened, and she pulled them into her booth, where she sold handmade jewelry. The town felt different, still flawed, but softer, as if time had worn down its sharp edges. As they wandered the fair, Ethan spotted his father in the crowd, older now, his shoulders stooped. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something regret. Perhaps. But his father turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Some wounds would never fully heal. Later, under the stars, Lucas pulled Ethan close. "We made it," he whispered. "Through all of it." Ethan nodded, his heart full. "And we're not done yet." The years brought new challenges and joys. Caleb graduated high school, his speech at the ceremony a bold declaration of self-love and acceptance that left Ethan and Lucas in tears. He chose to stay in Richmond for college, studying art like Lucas, his confidence a stark contrast to the scared boy they'd met years ago. Ethan and Lucas married in a small ceremony at the LGBTQ Center, surrounded by friends and Ethan's mother. The vows they exchanged were simple but fierce, a promise to weather any storm together. Caleb was their best man, his grin wide as he handed them the rings. Life wasn't perfect. Lucas still struggled with nightmares, and Ethan carried the weight of his father's silence. But they had each other, and they had Caleb, who filled their home with energy and hope. They became advocates, speaking at local events about their journey, helping others find the courage to live authentically. One winter, a letter arrived from Pastor Kane. It was short, written in shaky handwriting. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Lucas read it over and over, his emotions a tangle of anger and relief. He didn't respond, but he kept the letter, a small crack in the wall his father had built. Ethan's mother became a regular visitor, her presence a bridge to a past they were slowly reclaiming. She brought photos of Ethan as a child, Stories of his early years that made him laugh and cry. "I'm proud of you," she said one day, her voice steady. "I always should have been." Caleb, now 20, came out as non-binary, choosing they/them pronouns. Ethan and Lucas embraced the change, learning alongside Caleb, their love unwavering. They watched Caleb grow into an artist and activist, their work challenging the norms of a world that had once tried to break them all. One evening, as snow fell outside, Ethan and Lucas sat with Caleb by the fireplace, sketching and talking about the future. "You saved me," Caleb said suddenly, their voice soft. "I don't know where I'd be without you." "You saved us too," Lucas replied, his eyes meeting Ethan's. "You reminded us what family means." Decades later, Ethan and Lucas sat on their porch, gray hair and laugh lines marking the years. Their house was a haven, its walls covered in Caleb's art and photos of their life together. Havenwood had changed, still imperfect, but more open, with pride flags in shop windows and a new generation unafraid to love. Caleb, now in their 30s, was a renowned artist, their work exhibited across the country. They visited often, bringing stories of their travels and their own found family. Ethan and Lucas had become grandparents of sorts, doting on Caleb's partner's children, teaching them to plant wildflowers and tell stories. One spring, Caleb organized an art exhibit in Havenwood, a homecoming of sorts. The theme was reclamation, a celebration of lives rebuilt after rejection. Ethan and Lucas's story was the centerpiece, told through Caleb's vibrant paintings. The final piece showed two young men holding hands under a stormy sky, with a third figure, child, reaching out to them, bathed in light. At the exhibit's opening, Ethan's father appeared, older and frail. He approached slowly, his eyes on the painting. "I didn't understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong, Ethan. About everything." Ethan's heart clenched, years of pain and hope colliding. He nodded, unable to speak, and his father reached out, his hand trembling. Ethan took it, and for the first time in decades, they embraced. Later, as the crowd thinned, Caleb found Lucas standing alone, staring at the painting. "You okay?" they asked. Lucas nodded, tears in his eyes. "I never thought we'd get here. Not after everything." Caleb hugged him, then reached for Ethan, pulling them both close. "You made it because you loved each other," they said. "And you loved me." The exhibit closed with a quiet moment, just the three of them under Havenwood's starry sky. Ethan looked at Lucas, the boy he'd loved through a storm, and Caleb, the child who'd become their heart. They'd been kicked out for loving, erased by those who should have protected them. But they'd built a family, a legacy, a love that no one could take away.